Today's topic, personality, motivation, and abnormality. I'd like to start with a story. This I found on Quora this morning. What is the strangest mental disability that you have ever witnessed? That's the question, and many people answered it, and here's one that I thought was worth sharing. I worked with someone with this condition in my training, and it has always left an imprint on my mind. Cotard's syndrome is where people have a delusion that they are either dead or they have no specific organs or organ systems. This lady was convinced she had no systems. She believed she had no veins, so she declined blood tests. She declined food because she thought she didn't have a digestive system. She once, I don't know if this is, anyway, appropriate, but she once defecated in front of me to show me that she doesn't have a digestive system and that the food goes straight through her. She declined EEG because she had no brain. As she deteriorated, she then believed she was living dead. We attempted to have discussions to rationalize her delusions, but she was firm that she could not understand why she was talking to us when she had no heart or brain. It was truly fascinating to show what the mind can do. This person had psychotic depression, which led to this syndrome. I think that's a good final point, because each of these syndromes that we make a name for often comes with associated psychological illnesses, other conditions. So we sometimes see a disorder that presents alone, but very often disorders present with other disorders, which makes it very difficult. It's the job of psychopathological researchers to dissect and separate, if possible, disorders from one another that come associated, maybe causally associated. Maybe they can't be separated, like depression and psychosis. But that's food for thought. All right. Motivation, early theory. Homeostatic drive theory is an old but very strong and still relevant theory that, it says these things. Biological and behavioral drives aim to regain optimal homeostasis. So it's the body trying to regain some optimal level, some level that is optimal for survival. We can typically learn behaviors that reduce drives by experience, such as hunger causes us to forage for food. Are other behavioral drives instincts? Would our children fail to maintain homeostasis if we did not teach them how? What do you think? Feel free to chime in right now.
I think that if we don't teach them, then the likelihood they will survive wouldn't be that high anyway, so they wouldn't get a chance to try out for themselves.
Especially at very young ages.
Yeah.
We're the type of species that can't really do certain things when we're just born. Like some species can walk the minute they're born. Some species can do certain things, but with humans, it takes a while for us to actually develop in any aspect. And the minute we're born, we're rather helpless. We have to learn all of these things from our parents.
Thank you. A good example of that is when a horse or a deer is born. They may not walk immediately, but within a few hours. They are walking already. How long does it take for humans to learn how to walk?
6 months? I'm not exactly sure.
8 months is a good amount. 10 months is a typical amount in some countries. It really depends on the country. Like countries in Africa, I studied this before. They give their infants a lot of walking practice before the infants can support their own body weight. Already, by a few months, they're practicing, the parents are giving the practice to their infants to walk. So the infants learn how to walk by the age of 7 or 8 months, whereas in other cultures where infants are held all the time and not encouraged to walk, they may learn how to walk by 10, 11, even 12 months of age. So, but clearly we're not walking within a few hours like some animals are. Why is that?
Maybe it's just a biological development that we're used to having parents helping us.
One of the reasons maybe because during the prenatal period we spend most of our resource developing our brain rather than developing other physical system.
Yeah, because I don't think like human babies have the worry of like getting eaten like other animals do.
It's true. Humans are the apex predator on this planet. Good point. That's a really good point. Okay, let's move on. Motivation. Life seeks pleasure and avoids pain. We seek optimum states, homeostases. Behaviorists capitalize on this using incentives. Behavioral researchers will offer a sweet liquid to animals such as monkeys or rats, and they will offer electric shocks to these animals as well. Humans. What do we do to humans? We add and remove privileges. This is behavioral conditioning. And these privileges are really the means by which we, as individuals, attempt to seek our own private homeostases. For example, we might want to get out of our seat and run around because we have an energetic drive to explore and use energy. Whereas if a child is told, because you have been misbehaving, you must sit in the corner for 5 minutes or something like that. This is taking away the privilege of seeking personal homeostases, like stimulation and exploration. Maybe exploration is not a good example of a homeostasis, but maybe it is. I don't know. We train ourselves. We are motivated to achieve happy, positive states of mind and avoid negative states. We learn which behaviors produce states of mind, and we behave to maximize positive states and minimize negative states. An example is that we study to avoid anxiety, guilt, and failure, or we choose not to study in order to avoid the unpleasant states of boredom and our freedom to maintain our optimal arousal and do more enjoyable activities. One of our homeostatic drives is to achieve optimal arousal. This is what I mentioned earlier with the example of a kid being punished with a timeout. We strive to maintain a certain level of arousal. If we are exploring and seeking stimulating activities, this suggests we are striving to increase our own personal level of alertness or arousal. Arousal is the general word. Sometimes people that are not familiar with the psychological use of this term arousal, the cognitive use of it, will think that arousal refers to sexual arousal, which is just one subtype. So in this lecture, arousal means cognitive arousal. When arousal is very high or very low, performance suffers. A simple task is performed best when arousal levels are relatively high. On complex tasks, it's better if arousal is low, but on simple tasks, it's better if arousal is high. So this graph illustrates that. And in general, this is called the Yerkes-Dodson curve that illustrates that there is an optimal level of arousal that we strive to maintain. And what level we strive to maintain depends on our goals. If we're striving to answer a difficult question on homework, we strive to reduce our arousal. So we might turn down the music or turn it off and close our door to our room to get us completely quiet and focused, to reduce arousal in order to reduce the noise, which enhances the signal that we are trying to detect, the signal of thought, the thought stream that we're trying to follow. Any comments or questions? Personality, the visible product of motivation. The root word personality comes from persona, which is another word for a mask worn by an actor to project a personality trait of a character in theater and conceal the actor's identity. This gets at the primary point in personality research. What is the self? Jung taught that the persona, the conscious perception of the self, is like a mask, like tree bark. It's the exterior, it's the outside. It is not, it's kind of part of us, and it's kind of not part of us. Just like tree bark, you can peel the bark of a tree away, and you are not peeling the tree necessarily. You're just peeling off its exterior coat, its mask. It is created by one's, so the persona is created by one's actions and their impact on others. Others' reactions. Jung said that others have to receive those actions and their reactions are participatory. So when I act out and you respond to my acting out, then we are co-creating my persona. So, therefore, the persona is not only one's own creation, but it is created through joint participation with others. One sees oneself in relation to others' actions and reactions with others, Therefore, the persona is never completely self-created. The personality is never completely self-created. This is Carl Jung speaking to us today in this lecture. So Jung said, others have to receive those actions, our actions, and their reactions are participatory in our social exchange, and we, seeing our own reactions along with their reactions to our reactions, and all of that, the back and forth cycle, gives us our concept of ourselves, gives us our idea of our own persona. So we read our own persona by observing through our own eyes and through our personal experience and our social cognition, reading what we think other people are trying to say about us based on their reactions to our responses and our actions. So persona is a very social and very cognitive creation. This is what is being proposed and understood if we can understand it, if we can understand what Carl Jung is saying. Personality theories. Okay, we can go start with Hippocrates, who said that our personality is the result of the ratios of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The Chinese traditional medicine offers that there are 5 basic elements and that we are composed of these elements in varying amounts or something like that. We have too much or not enough earth, fire, wood, water, and metal. Maybe that's in our environment, maybe in our diet, I don't know. Or in our, I don't know. Hindu Ayurvedic medicine suggests that our personality and illnesses may be due to the balance of 3 doshas: the kapha, which is water and earth, the pitta, which is water and fire, and the vata, which is space and air. There's some redundancy with water, but it's not about the absolute number of items here, it's the balance, the proportions that are important, so the ratio. And next we have Freud, who offered that personality is the result of these 3 aspects of the self. There are the id, the ego, and the superego. I will not be talking about these in this lecture, but they are theoretical components of the self in Freudian theory. And we have the trait theories, which are descriptive but not explanatory. So unlike the previous theories, the previous 4 that I've mentioned here in this list, the trait theory, which is the dominant theory of personality psychology today, is not actually a theory. It's just an observation that we have stable patterns of behaviors and motivations, and we have labels for them. They are, we'll talk about that later. And social cognitive perspective says that reciprocal determinism is a thing. This is an explanation for why we have the personalities that we do. So we'll get to that. Any questions? The social cognitive perspective first. We'll start with the last one first. And we're not really going to go through all of these theories. But leading off from the last one, the social cognitive perspective. So Alfred Bandura agreed with behaviorists, but with additional cognitive elements. So behaviorists don't really like to include cognitive anything. They treat the mind as a black box, and they just keep their hands off of it and say, we're not touching it. We don't want to talk about it. We only want to talk about what is observable. But the cognitive and the social cognitive perspective started to become clearly necessary and valuable around maybe the 1960s to 1970s. Maybe the seeds of it started earlier, as is true with every movement. Alfred Bandura agreed with behaviorism, but with additional cognitive elements. Vicarious learning, self-efficacy, which is the having confidence in personal abilities. Reciprocal determinism, that we choose our environment and therefore are the creators and products of our situations. Interacting elements, such as cognitive processes, learned beliefs and expectations, and behaviors, which are actions that can be rewarded or punished, and context, which is the environmental and situation, including rewards and punishments. So these three elements interact. And the fifth one, locus of control, that we have an internal or an external locus of control, such as I create my reality versus my environment creates my reality. Now, I mentioned Alfred Bandura, but he's just the first and most prominent of the social cognitive researcher theorists. That one of the most influential to the development of social cognition, I could say. But the next one that we should talk about is Julian Rotter, and he came up with the locus of control idea, or at least he conducted experiments and research to become the dominant person behind this notion of locus of control. So about locus of control, researchers have found that people with an internal locus of control perform better academically, achieve more in their careers, are more independent, are healthier, are better able to cope, and are less depressed than people who have an external locus of control. And here on this list, we see, again, internal locus of control. I control the consequences of my behavior. Is associated with better academic achievement, better interpersonal relations, better efforts to learn positive attitudes to exercise, lower cigarette smoking, lower hypertension and heart attacks. All these great things. Well, what do we get with external locus of control? More resigned to conditions as they are, lower efforts to deal with health problems, lower levels of psychological adjustment. So all of these are negative, but in non-responsive environments, there's a greater sense of satisfaction. So there is a time and a context and a place for having an external locus of control. You want an external locus of control when you have no control. You want an internal locus of control when there is control to be had, control to be the control that is available to you. Any questions?
Is locus of control related to growth and fixed mindset, or is it an entirely different thing?
Thank you. That's absolutely connected. Thank you. Because the growth mindset, as I mentioned in that lecture, depends on you believing in it. Just like locus of control depends on you believing that you have control. People with an external locus of control don't believe that they have control. People with a growth mindset believe they have that ability to grow. People with an internal locus of control believe that they have control. Yeah, thank you. That's great. Good point. Good connecting.
I'm sorry, but what do you mean by like non-responsive environment? Like greater sense of satisfaction?
Yes. Okay, a non-responsive environment. Okay.
Life imprisonment.
You might have a good example. Can you say that again?
Life imprisonment.
Life in prison.
Yes.
Absolutely. Very good. If you can imagine yourself in a prison cell and the guards don't pay any attention to you, you can be a very good prisoner and you can behave yourself and do everything according to the rules, and you just get ignored. Or you can misbehave and be a nuisance, and you can also be ignored. And when you notice these things, you notice that your behavior has no impact on your environment, and you learn that you are in a non-responsive environment, at which point it is healthy for you to adopt an external locus of control for your own greater sense of satisfaction, so that you learn that your being ignored is not your fault. It's simply the state of that environment. That's a good example. Thank you. Hopefully we don't find ourselves in non-responsive environments very often. It's not an ideal kind of environment. Walter Mischel, who is Rotter's student, and Bandura's colleague, defined self-regulation as the design and designed a study to assess it in young children, and gave us the famous marshmallow test, which you may or may not have seen. Have you seen this test?
Yes.
Briefly.
Where did you see it?
On
It was
YouTube.
in high school.
In our program or not?
Oh,
No,
not in the
not
program.
High school. Oh, okay. Okay, so I'm going to show it to you. I'm sorry, 1 second. I'm trying to exclude. Okay, so do you think that this experiment was ethical?
There was nothing wrong about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's no harm to the children. They weren't being They weren't being denied any comfort. They were told what was going to happen. It seemed pretty ethical.
Yeah, it's also actually beneficial to the child. It taught them self-control,
Yeah.
basically.
Not the marshmallow.
Yeah, when it worked, you know.
Very good. I
No,
agree.
but I'm not sure about the ethics that like if the children were aware that they were being recorded.
It's depend on the parent permission because they don't have the required awareness of it. So
Yeah.
the children are underage and they need their parent consideration and permission to participate in the experiment anyway.
That's right. Like someday they might object to being recorded there, but that's really just it's like it's a trick of the mind, really, because at the time their parents were responsible for the decision. But when they grow up later and they think, hey, I didn't give permission to be recorded, that's when they are responsible. At least that's, I think that's how I make sense of it. Anyway, I appreciate your views. I think that, I think you're right. I think that this is a normal level of demand to put on a child, and it's teaching them an important life skill, and it's not directly harming them to have them self-impose restrictions on their own desire to consume a marshmallow. It's kind of like psychological torture to have it there and not be able to eat it, but it's self-inflicted psychological torture, which is acceptable, I think. And it's for our own good, because the exercising and development of this self-discipline, which is this self-inflicted psychological torture of denying yourself what you crave, is so associated with positive development and positive character and success in life, that it's like medicine that we don't enjoy, but it's good for us. Self-regulation in identifying goals and using feedback, both internal and external, such as thoughts and affect and responses to physical and social environment. So identifying these to maximize goal attainment, that is self-regulation. Self-regulation is also known as willpower, the ability to delay gratification.
It wasn't just willpower though in the video, in the experiment for the one boy that did pass the test. If you look closely, you can see that he was distracting himself and he was trying not to think about the marshmallow, trying not to look at the marshmallow. At one point in the end, he was resting his head within his arm and pushing away the marshmallow out of his sight. So there's trick to this thing.
Good noticing. And I like that you brought that up, because I hope that you guys noticed all of these distraction techniques that these children were attempting to using to cope with this unbearable temptation. Now, I use these words self-torture and unbearable, but really, it's all subjective. And I think there's a really deep lesson to learn from that. The fact that psychological torture is subjective. But that's not my main point, or it's not related to this lecture exactly. It is willpower because these distraction techniques are attempts to wrestle with willpower. They are tools used by the self for the personal goals. And they take a will. They require your will to do it. If you have a will for the goal of getting that second marshmallow, and you engage in whatever kinds of self-regulation strategies, such as maybe it's distraction is the easy one, engaging in, there's some other more advanced tools. Yeah. Any other comments or thoughts? Response? More on the social cognitive perspective. Oh, okay. More on self-efficacy. One's sense of self-efficacy is crucial in motivating behavior. Knowing our capacity to accomplish determines what we attempt to do and what our goals are and what goals we set. People with high self-efficacy have a positive, people with high self-efficacy have a positive outlook and see challenges as tasks to be mastered. They develop a deep interest in involved activities and quickly recover from setbacks. People with low self-efficacy avoid challenging tasks because they doubt their abilities and they focus on failures and get demoralized. This self-efficacy may sound very much like self-esteem. You might just think of it like self-esteem. They're very close. An example, if you believe that you can win a competition, you will take on a challenging training regime and not let setbacks demoralize you. Self-efficacy, efficacy comes from the root word effective. So if you believe that you are effective, you have self-efficacy. It means that you believe that you are efficacious or effective. Any questions? What is the self? So I used the word self-efficacy, but I didn't define the self yet. So I want to do that, even though it seems somewhat philosophical to attempt to wrestle with the definition of the self. But here's some effort. You may, but don't feel you must, identify yourself using the following typical psychological perspective. The self is the organizer of thoughts, feelings, and actions. Individualists, in other words, a Western perspective, identifies the self in the brain. Every culture specifies what they think consciousness is. In my opinion, the self is the only thing that can define itself. It is what you identify with. It is consciousness itself. Not the brain or the body, but the consciousness that we associate with the brain and the body. My advice is for you regarding coming up with your own definition of the self is to listen to experience itself and to know intuitively what consciousness is and what the self is. Understanding the self underlies all understanding. Okay, so now I'm getting very philosophical. Understanding the self underlies all understanding. And here's my evidence. When you have personal motivations, if you want to understand those, you have to understand the personal part. You have personal beliefs, but to understand them, you have to understand why you hold them, maybe. And everything you have is personal. You have personal this, personal that. So to understand any of it requires that you have some, at least some, understanding of self. So having personal anything implies partial understanding of self. Any thoughts? Now I move on to, now I offer you a 10-minute break. This is a good break time. All right, so let's start again at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.
Welcome back from the break. I'm continuing from this slide, Neo-Freudian theorists and theories of personality. So I'll be talking about, so I've mentioned social cognitive perspective, now Neo-Freudian perspective, and there's the modern perspective also. I think that's all. The Neo-Freudian perspective. So this is, well, Freud's contemporary, 1930s. So it's quite old, but the period of Neo-Freudian lasted quite a while, I believe. Alfred Adler proposed the inferiority complex, the feeling that lack of worth, not measuring up to the standards of society, motivates all our striving for superiority. So we strive to accomplish and achieve because we feel like we don't stack up to societal expectations. So it all stems from a psychological complex, which is another word for a complicated, a complex assortment of forces that are usually rooted in some kind of pathology or produce some kind of pathology. Yeah, usually a complex produces a pathology. So I don't like this definition because it suggests that we strive to achieve because we feel like failures. But it's not my place to judge these theories, I'm just teaching on them. So, a noteworthy quote: "The happiness of mankind lies in working together, in living as if each individual had set himself the task of contributing to the common welfare." That's a nice quote, I like that one. So it supposes that man is motivated, mankind, to to contribute to the common good, supposing that mankind is good, good-willed. The main goal of psychology is to recognize the equal rights and equality of others. Again, very positive message and quote, so I do like this Alfred Adler character. Erik Erikson is a quite famous developmental psychologist. He's not only known as developmental, he's also social psychological, or just, social cognitive, or just cognitive. But he's a neo-Freudian. He's influenced by Freudian theory, but he took that Freudian theory and morphed it into his own theory. So he developed his psychosocial stages of theory of development that goes across the lifespan rather than being limited to the childhood years. Freud's original theory was limited to up through adolescence and early adulthood, but neo-Freudian theory goes to the end of life with the approximate age of the last one, ego, integrity versus despair, happening after the age of 65, roughly. All right, so all of these, what are called crises in these 8 stages, are competitions between values, like the value of trust versus the value of mistrust.
Mr. Jason?
Yes.
I think we can also tie specifically the last part, ego, integrity versus despair, with what Alfred Adler said in the previous slide, being that all of us are motivated by our inferiority complex comes from how we all want to benefit humanity in a sense. And with the last part being that it's either you look through your life and you think, um, I've I've lived life as full as I could, or you despair over how much you've missed out. It could be connected because you feel despair because you haven't fulfilled that inner need to help society, help the world, or at least try to.
True.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you. So tying Adler and his inferiority complex. Well, were you talking about the inferiority complex? I couldn't quite hear everything you said.
Yes, yes.
Yes, right. Good. I can think about that more. It's good. Thank you. The next theorist is Karen Horney, who proposed coping styles. And again, this is a kind of theory with complexes, explaining complexes. Actually, I should not be so negative toward the term complex as a personality theory, because we all know that psychopathology is a common and widespread phenomenon, and relating it to forces that also give rise to personality is an intelligent, reasonable approach. So Karen Horney's theory is that when we are inflexible in our usage of coping styles, this produces neuroticism, or a neurotic complex. So we have these 3 basic coping styles: moving toward people, away from people, or against people. So you can read these. The next neo-Freudian is my favorite psychologist of all time, I would say. I am a fan of Carl Jung. He proposed that the self is the conscious and the unconscious, largely common among all peoples, and that this contains stories and myths found in all cultures of the world, archetypes like the hero, the maiden, the sage, and the trickster. The job of the self in the second half of life is to identify and integrate unconscious content into the conscious sense of self, to reach self-realization. Jung believed the persona as a compromise, he defined it as a compromise between who we really are and what society expects us to be. We hide the parts of ourselves that are not aligned with society's expectations. And earlier I mentioned that Jung said that the persona is the exterior, the bark of the tree, which is formed by the joint cooperative efforts of reacting to one another between self and others. So we, anything that doesn't agree with what we perceive society to expect of us, based on society's expectations or based on social learning, we learn to hide that from ourselves and from each other. Now, I've said that this is my favorite psychologist, but I would then have to say how many other psychologists I also admire and look up to and support. There's a lot of them. And even if I critique Freud, I still look up to him a great deal as well. So there's many great minds that we study whenever we study the theories of psychology. Humanistic theorists and theories of personality. Oh, that's the next era, I could say, era of psychological thought that I bring into this lecture, as these theorists also have something to say about personality and how it's formed. So we go to humanistic theories now. Abraham Maslow, you'll recognize his name probably because he's so well known for his hierarchy of needs, as illustrated here. He studied healthy, creative, and productive people. Now that's a change from other psychologists, because most psychologists study psychopathology and what can go wrong with people as a way of studying and determining what makes us tick. But Maslow approached from the opposite side, from studying our most impressive humans. Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, these are choices from a Western lens. It would be great if Maslow went and studied some great figures, living and deceased, from the East as well as the West, but apparently he's stuck with Western idols. Maslow found they share similar characteristics, being open, creative, loving, spontaneous, compassionate, concerned for others, and accepting themselves. Maslow's hierarchy of needs proposes needs must be met in a certain order. The highest need is the need for self-actualization, which is the achievement of our fullest potential. All right, so here's that up top. But we don't really have a need for this when we are struggling for breath, for example. If we can't breathe, we're being choked, we're not thinking about self-realization. In fact, we're not even thinking about safety needs. When you're being choked, you're thinking about getting air. So you're staying right at the bottom level until you satisfy that need. Once you satisfy your need at one level, you then shift your awareness to the next level of need on the hierarchy. So once you have breath, food, and water, sex, sleeps, and other homeostatic drives, then you seek the next level, security of sustainable supply of those homeostatic drive-reducing needs. And then the third level is love. And you can read them here. Humanistic theories and theories of personality. Carl Rogers is the next one. He divided the self into two categories, the ideal self and the real self. We see this represented in theory after theory. So we saw this, the ideal and the real in, who was that? That was Maslow? No, not Maslow. Yeah, I'm sorry, never mind. But this idea of the ideal and the real is represented in Carl Jung's approach and some other, I think, that I mentioned on this lecture. Rogers focused on the idea that we need to achieve consistency between these two selves. So we experience congruence when our thoughts about our real self and ideal self are very similar, when our self-concept is accurate. High congruence leads to greater sense of self-worth and healthy, productive life. Incongruence leads to maladjustment in this theory. And other theories say that incongruence leads to cognitive dissonance, which is uncomfortable, and we strive to reduce cognitive dissonance. Which is more of a cognitive-only theory. Parents can help their children achieve congruence by giving them unconditional positive regard or unconditional love. I think that's a neat and nice and agreeable theory that we can facilitate greater congruence, which is away from psychopathology, by giving unconditional love. And humanistic psychologists who practice therapy from the humanistic perspective offer their clients something called unconditional positive regard, which is basically like unconditional love in the therapist room or setting, which is like saying, I accept you and love you no matter what you've done, no matter what you're like, what your thinking is like that. Personality today. So now we move into the modern era, the 5-factor model. Now, when I say the modern era, I don't mean to say that the humanistic perspective or the neo-Freudian perspectives are no longer in use, or the social cognitive one. All of these perspectives are still relevant today. But instead of dividing ourselves by, I'm a neo-Freudian, I'm a social cognitive, I'm a humanist, we try to not divide ourselves so much by these schools of thought? Well, actually, we still do divide. There's a lot of division among psychologists still in these different schools, and sort of like characterizing ourselves like as I'm a gestaltist or I'm a this or that kind of psychologist. But I think more and more, at least I hope, that more and more we are looking for ways to integrate across the schools and accept the merits and the validities of all of the different schools. But it's a gradual process because we have to figure out how different schools of thoughts with their differing theories and differing explanations might match up and mesh together. All right, so that was an aside. Personality today. We have the 5-factor model, the most well-known, the most well-accepted model of personality is the 5-factor model because it hits a middle ground between not too many traits to be useful and not too few traits that we miss important features of thinking and behavior and feeling. It is the most popular personality model in psychology today. And I have some things to read here. The big 5 traits are relatively stable over our lifespan, with some tendency for the traits to increase or decrease slightly. Researchers have found that conscientiousness increases through young adulthood into middle adulthood as we become better able to manage our personal relationships and careers. Agreeableness also increases with age, peaking between 50 to 70 years of age. Neuroticism and extroversion tend to decline slightly with age. Additionally, the big 5 traits have been shown to exist across ethnicities, cultures, ages, and may have substantial genetic and biological components. Asian cultures are more collectivist, and people in these cultures tend to be less extroverted. People in Central and South American cultures tend to score higher on openness to experience. Central and South American cultures. I don't know what it is about that then. Whereas Europeans score higher on neuroticism, which is a trait that we generally don't want to be very high. It might have something to do with their individualist culture. Individualist cultures and collectivist cultures place emphasis on different basic values. People who live in individualist cultures tend to believe that independence, competition, and personal achievement are important. Individuals in Western nations, such as the United States, England, and Australia, score high on individualism. People who live in collectivist cultures value social harmony, respectfulness, and group needs over individual needs. Individuals who live in countries in Asia, Africa, South America score higher on collectivism. These values influence personality. For example, Yang found that people in individualist cultures displayed more individually oriented personality traits, whereas people in collectivist cultures displayed more socially oriented personality traits. Kind of obvious. I thought of one interesting point to say. As I read this out loud, I realized that this Western or individualist emphasis on competition is in direct contrast or in direct proportion, inverse proportion to its opposite. What is the opposite of competition?
Cooperation.
Cooperation.
Yeah.
So the collectivist culture emphasizes cooperation. Now I could go off on a tangent on that, but I think I better stick with the lecture. Abnormal psychology. What is abnormal in the first place? Okay, psychopathology, which comes from the word psychology or psyche, and pathology, which means sickness, is where we get the word, is the same subject as abnormal psychology. So these are synonyms. The study of abnormal thought, feelings, and behaviors, including their symptoms, etiology, and treatments. Abnormal means atypical, deviating from the norm. But some atypical conditions are not disorders. Albinism is not a disorder. Just because something is rare does not mean that it is a problem or wrong. And some disorders are not atypical. For example, alcohol use disorder is very common in Thailand, with the rates being between 9 and 10%. I looked up the rates in Thailand and in the US just for comparison. It's 6.3% in the US. And the rates are higher in some other countries, as high as over 20%, I think, if I remember correctly, in some countries, in some areas. So the point being that psychopathology is usually influenced and defined as atypical and as disorder. Yet disorders are not atypical and atypical is not disorder. So it's this kind of like partnership between these concepts that gives us what we usually refer to as abnormal psychological conditions. But we are tending now toward the pathology part, the sickness part, in our more modern definitions of psychopathology. So, cultures define normalcy. So what we think of as normal is culturally defined, or defined by the masses, by people, which affects the conditions that people manifest. So when people express a sickness, a psychological sickness, they express it in ways that are culturally understood because they are manifested by the individual who is a product of the culture. An example is having a vision. This is considered abnormal in some countries, but it is normal in others. Normalcy is context and time dependent. And here's a little website that illustrates that normality is context and time dependent. Here are things that are no longer normal, but
I'm sorry. Sending kids through the...
Say again?
Wait, did people really send kids through the mail?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. This was a thing.
Wow.
So because mail was weighed and it was cheaper to send a child through the mail than through the train, like sending a child from, from the parents to the uncle or grandparents, like especially maybe when the parents had too many children or they died or something. So how do you get a child from point A to point B cheaply? Back when travel was difficult and expensive, the mail system. So here we go. Here's another, outdoor baby cages. So why not build an extra little space add-on to your apartment? What's the problem? As long as it's safe. But it's
Can't
not.
put them next to like trains and stuff. You know, when you're like next to a train in like New York, it shakes a little bit.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh, I see. So yeah, maybe that's why they did it, to take out the window, because the window rattles. Just build a extension of your room right there. Garden hermits. This is not very common, but in 18th century, people used to not only allow a homeless person to be living in their backyard, but to encourage it as a sign of your wealth. If you could have a garden hermit, that meant that you were really well off, well to do, because you had your own hermit living in your backyard. We used to treat tooth pain with cocaine.
I remember this one.
Nice.
And nice.
Good old days.
The good old days, that's
Yeah,
right.
when you change
The
toothpaste.
good old days.
They don't prescribe that when I go to the dentist these days.
Yeah, not anymore.
No. Smoking during pregnancy, obviously that's not done anymore. Yeah, so that was a fun website that I found to illustrate the point that normality is context dependent, time dependent. The risk of diagnosing conditions as pathological. Thomas Sayes wrote an influential book that warned the public about diagnoses which aimed to marginalize segments of the population. He pushed back against diagnosing homosexuality as a pathology, paving the way for later social and civil rights of gays and lesbians. Psychology and psychiatry institute norms of thought, experience, and behavior. And I italicized the word institute because psychology and psychiatry are well-respected, influential institutions. Institutions are things that are accepted by society as having some authority. So when psychology and psychiatry institute a norm of thought, experience, and behavior, that is the case of a man-made organization making a judgment on society, on people, and influencing people to accept that judgment as legitimate, as truth. So we do want to be a bit careful when our respected authorities institute a norm, any kind of norm. We should watch out for unethical labeling of pathology when a condition is merely inconvenient to larger institutions or society. Now, towards an ethical definition of psychopathology. No universal definition of psychological disorders exists that can apply to all currently accepted disorders. But we do have good definitions today. I mean, I can say that our modern definitions are good, but I am influenced by the Institute of Psychology, such as the APA, the American Psychological Association, is an institute. It is an authority, and we should probably assume that we are influenced by it. Wakefield defined psychological disorders as a harmful dysfunction. The dysfunction must lead to negative consequences for the individual or for others, as judged by the standards of the culture. This is a modern view. The harm may include significant internal anguish, such as high levels of anxiety or depression, or problems in day-to-day living, such as in one's social or work life. So it is harmful dysfunction, and the dysfunction causes negative consequences for the individual or for others. So dysfunction is loosely defined. It can be even dysfunction just for the self, even if it's not bothering anyone else. So this is a pretty allowing, kind of open interpretation that is expansive to include disorders that only affect the self or that only affect others, even if the self is perfectly fine and accepting of it, but it affects either the self or others or both, and is harmful. Harmful is a subjective term, but it can be objective as well. So I think this is a pretty good definition. I have something to read here. To illustrate, Janet has an extreme fear of spiders. Janet's fear might be considered a dysfunction in that it signals that the internal mechanism of learning is not working correctly. A faulty process prevents Janet from appropriately associating the magnitude of her fear with the actual threat posed by spiders. Janet's fear of spiders has a significant negative influence on her life. She avoids all situations in which she suspects spiders to be present. For example, in the basement of a friend's room. And she quits her last job last month. This is just a hypothetical. Because she saw spiders in the restroom and is now unemployed because she quit her job. Now that's causing harmful dysfunction because it's harmful to herself to lose employment and sense of meaning in her life. According to the harmful dysfunction model, Janet's condition would signify a disorder because there is a dysfunction in an internal mechanism, the fear mechanism, and the dysfunction has resulted in harmful consequences. Similar to how the symptoms of physical illness reflect dysfunctions in biological processes, the symptoms of psychological disorders presumably reflect dysfunctions in mental processes. The internal mechanisms component of this model is especially appealing because it implies that disorders may occur through a breakdown of biological functions that govern various psychological processes, thus supporting contemporary neurobiological models of psychological disorders. And I can add there that the biological perspective is particularly strong and dominant in modern psychology. So we often see psychologists, maybe even myself included, tying mental disorders to physiological causes, that is a side effect of thinking that biology is a necessary component or a necessary perspective in psychology.
But wasn't there a phrase describing that everything psychological is also at the same time biological?
That's good. That's a biological perspective. Right. Yes. Anytime we can say something like, we have found the neural locus or the neural correlate of a pathological behavior or of a normal behavior or a normal ability. This is kind of like, yes, it's associating them, and it proves the biological model is dominant today, or it's important to us today. All right, here is the APA's definition of a disorder. A condition that is said to consist of the following. There are significant disturbances in thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. The disturbance reflects some kind of biological, psychological, or developmental dysfunction. The disturbance leads to significant distress or disability in one's life. And the disturbance does not represent expected or culturally approved responses to certain events. That last point is kind of like isolating the typical from the atypical. And the earlier 3 points are about the dysfunction or the illness component. So we do have a combined definition today. It combines the atypical part, which is that 4th bullet point, with the dysfunction or sickness part, which is the first 3 bullets. And let's see. Let me read this to you as well. In truth, no single approach to defining a psychological disorder is adequate by itself, nor is there a universal agreement on where the boundary between disorder and not disorder exists. From time to time, we all experience anxiety, unwanted thoughts, moments of sadness. Our behavior at other times may not make much sense to ourselves or to others. These inner experiences and behaviors can vary in their intensity, but are only considered disorders when they are highly disturbing to us or to others. This suggests a dysfunction in normal mental functioning when it is highly disturbing to ourselves or to others, and are associated with significant distress or disability in social or occupational activities.
Adopt มาแบบ
Diagnosing. The International Classification of Diseases is the most used worldwide for diagnoses. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is the most commonly used one in the US, and it is the most commonly used in research in the world. So ICD more for application, and DSM more for research, as well as application in the US. It's important to remember that a disorder is not what a person is, but it is what they have. This distinction separates the disorder from the identity, and that is politically correct. A person is not a schizophrenic, but a person with schizophrenia. And this little distinction in the way that we speak and write to be politically correct is to encourage us in a kind of a preferable mindset that we can separate the person from his or her disorder. And I see that as a positive thing, personally. What do you think? Is it good to separate the person from their disorder, or do you think we should keep them together with the label?
We shouldn't. Just to respect ourselves and like this field and also the patients.
That's a very good perspective. Thank you. Good. We might have some chats going on. Let's see. Not relevant to this. Okay. Perspectives on psychological disorders. Oops. Historically and still currently, common in parts of the world is the view that disorders are caused by black magic or spirit possession. I wonder, do we have some of this kind of idea prevalent in Thailand?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
I think especially with black magic and love, I
Yeah.
think.
Good.
When I was getting into psychology, a lot of my peers and like parents' friend told me that not to do it in an Asian setting because they might attribute it to dark magic or something. I thought they were joking. But
Yeah, but apparently not. Yeah, I hear that often.
yeah, I heard that a lot from my
Wait,
parents.
let me get this straight. You're saying the advice is not to practice psychology in Thailand?
Like they said like in Asia or
In
something.
Asia?
Yeah, they said that either they believe in like magic or they'll deal with it themselves or something.
Oh, interesting.
That's just from my parents' friends.
Yes, that's very interesting because that, to me, that represents a conflict of philosophies. There's the black magic philosophy, and there's the psychology philosophy about illness and disorder and treating people. They're like different religions, and one will always fight against another. I call it the war of ideas. Then there's the curious case of dancing mania, which we currently view as a kind of mass hysteria, actually. But I wrote here on the slide, trance states.
You mean the one where one person was dancing in the street and a bunch of people slowly started joining her? It
So
became
like they
a
die.
line of people dancing, and some of them died because they were exhausted. They didn't eat food for days on end. It's the most famous example of mass hysteria that took over like a village or two.
Very good, you know about it.
Yeah.
Have you, anyone else heard of that?
I heard
Yes.
of it, never really looked into it much.
Learned a lot of the history.
Very interesting phenomenon. Do you want to say anything more about black magic or spirit possession as a view in Thailand? Or
I think it's very undeveloped.
undeveloped?
You know, like if you have science, you don't believe in black magic.
Mm,
It shows development and everything. I'm sorry, Thailand.
I see. Well, I would say that it is developed, that it is kind of developed like any theory is. And that the theories of black magic and the theories of psychology are both theories, and they're both developed. So it is, I say, it is the war of ideas.
I think it's like personal preference. Like if you believe it, just like you believe in God, it's fine. But don't force me to think it's black magic. Most of
Right?
them try to force me, make me think like that.
Good. That's right. Don't force your ideologies down my throat. Very good. That's right.
Mr. Jason,
Yes.
um, going back to like mass hysteria and such like that, I've
Mhm.
also heard of some cases where, let's say, myths about ghosts and slashers and murderers, they become overblown with people who thought they saw said mysterious phenomenon, and it continues on to be like a whole, for a while, a whole bunch of people believe that this sort of stuff happens. Like you take Japan with all their cryptids, masked women stabbings, and it gets hard for like law enforcement to take it seriously because of all the stories and stuff. Why do you think that mass hysteria is still prevalent even now? It's something as simple as a person saw someone getting attacked and they gave a vague description that turned into a monster.
That's a great question. Why does mass hysteria exist? And that's such a great question. I don't know if I am worthy to answer it. Um, but it's not just a modern phenomenon. As this slide points out, from 11th to 17th centuries, we have many centuries of dancing mania, which is a kind of mass hysteria. It's just one kind. And there's many kinds of mass hysteria. And there's many kinds of manifestations of psychological disorders that today we think is just weird, like demon possession. Like, what is that? Um, so never mind. So now looking only at mass hysteria, the fact that it exists suggests that that the troubling component, the illness that someone is struggling with, is can be spread like a virus. That it can be through influence, I assume. You know, it's not like two people independently go into dancing mania. They go into it together because one sees the other one doing it. And it's that influence. Something about seeing it. I can't really comment too much on dancing
Perhaps they
mania,
were bored.
but it's by influence somehow. I don't know, it's extremely provocative and interesting, and I'd love to learn more about it. I have more to read about that particular one. A curious epidemic swept across Western Europe. Groups of people would suddenly begin to dance wildly. This compulsion to dance sometimes gripped thousands of people at a time. Historical accounts indicate that those afflicted would sometimes dance with bruised and bloody feet, days or weeks. screaming of terrible visions and begging priests and monks to save their souls. The cause of dancing mania remains unclear. Historian John Waller has suggested a combination of three factors: psychological distress, social contagion, and belief in supernatural forces. Waller argued that various disasters of the time, such as famine, plagues, and floods, produced high levels of psychological distress that could increase the likelihood of succumbing to an involuntary trance state. This is just speculation. Waller indicated that anthropological studies and accounts of possession rituals show that people are more likely to enter a trance state if they expect it to happen, and that entranced individuals behave in a ritualistic manner, their thoughts and behaviors shaped by the spiritual beliefs of their culture. Thus, during periods of extreme physical and mental distress, all it took were a few people believing themselves to have been afflicted with a dancing curse to slip into a spontaneous trance and then act out the part of one who is cursed by dancing for days on end. What I read, one thing that struck me was they expect it to happen. If they expect it to happen, that's where the power of the influence comes in. So, dancing mania, somehow it got, somehow it started. I don't know how it started, but once it got started, people came to believe that it was influential. And that believing that it's influential makes it influential. So now I'm kind of understanding how this works. It is a placebo effect because the placebo effect works by believing in it. The placebo effect in the case of an illness that is thought to be spread by influence becomes an influence spread by influence. An illness spread by influence. Mass hysteria. Interesting. All right. Well, that's my theory now. Any thoughts? Would you like to share any of your own ideas or thoughts?
Well, my theory is that it perhaps could be a simple case of boredom. When a story of like housewife being gossip mongers, and they start creating stories on their own without any truth, and then it was just a phenomenon of itself.
Oh, yeah.
As when in the Middle Age, people were working the field doing simple menial tasks. Well, they have something to do, yes, but there was no meaning to it. They were bored, or at least I think they were bored. And when people are bored, they do strange stuff.
Yes. Yes. Good point. And I think you're right. And I just realized when you said that there's a modern day example of this. Trolls. Maybe this is what you were getting at. Trolls, internet trolls will sometimes, okay, I'm thinking on Facebook. They will post a made up story, a made up thinking, a made up belief. Let's go with story. And it will spread massively, very quickly. People will get riled up about this story. And then someone will eventually say, I checked it out, it's not real. And so the story will it might continue on for a while anyway.
I think it's a little bit of both for me. The reason mass hysteria can be so effective at times, it can spread like a virus. It's not only just because of the boredom. That's how it starts. It starts off because someone either believed or wanted to start something that was unbelievable. Back then, people believed in spirits, demons, and such like that. So these sort of things wasn't too, they expected it to happen. So that expectation allows for something like this to be plausible. And now with murderers, with the ghosts and stuff, these are things that you don't expect, but deep down we want to expect it. When we hear stories of people in mass, people dancing, it fulfills that expectation. Because in belief, I've learned, in belief is not really about what is factual, but rather what's the most convenient. And if these stories are convenient to your own, like almost childish want for something to be more than just, hey, life's like this. You want to believe there's fairies, want to believe there's crazy stuff like this exists. That idea catches on, and the mundane suddenly becomes more than that. And because of that, it becomes an idea repeated constantly to the point that you trick yourself, you delude yourself into believing that there's a chance that that might happen to you, and then you might join the hysteria because you fooled yourself into believing it, like with the killers, with the dancing, with even the Salem witch trials. That's an example of that expectation of there being more and having it control your thoughts. There were innocent people that were killed in those trials because they simply thought that was the right thing to do.
Yes.
It's crazy.
So well said. I especially like what you said, that we believe it not because it's true, but because we want to believe it.
It's a convenient truth that makes sense to us.
A
And once we
convenient,
have that convenience, we can't let it go.
Right.
absolutely. Very good. Well said. Thank you. There's some chats. Let me check them. Stress also plays a big role because there's famine and disease back then. Very, very true. The biological perspective, currently thriving, views psychological disorders as linked to biological phenomena such as genetic factors, chemical imbalances, and brain abnormalities. Most psychological disorders have been found to have a genetic component. There seems little dispute that some disorders are largely due to genetic factors. Today's researchers search for genes and mutations that contribute to mental disorders. They use sophisticated neural imaging technology to see abnormalities in brain structure and function and study neurotransmitters and hormones. So, the biological perspective is strong. It's strong for a reason, and it is thriving and influential on our take and on how we think of psychology and psychopathology. The psychosocial perspective emphasizes the importance and interrelation of learning, thoughts, stress, and the environment. That's with Bandura. I called it psychosocial here. Psychosocial. Well, it's just, I think a better word for it would be social cognitive, but maybe psychosocial was the word choice I used just to mean that it's social. It's the influence of, well, there's no social included here. I don't know why I called it that. Perspectives on psychological disorders. The diathesis stress model combines the psychosocial and biological perspectives. I'm starting to remember now. Okay, the psychosocial model is merely that there is an interaction between these things: learning, thoughts, stress, environment. All right, so having now that terminology, we can understand the diathesis stress model because it incorporates the psychosocial model with the biological perspective. The development of any disease or disorder is the result of a diathesis. And that word diathesis means biological or psychological susceptibility. The precursors or the susceptibility. And stress, which can be something uncontrollable, something like a virus or trauma or social pressure, something outside of the self. And the diathesis and stress are considered sufficient and necessary. Only these two, and they must occur together for a disease to occur. That is the diathesis stress model. And that is a very strong and well-supported model of disease. So it's the susceptibility and stress. And susceptibility, if we go back a slide, is due to the interrelation of learning, thoughts, stress, and the environment. Actually, that's really just kind of summarizing. The psychosocial perspective summarizes. It's very internal to the diathesis stress model. Types of disorders and examples. We have anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, mood disorders, personality disorders, dissociative disorders, and childhood disorders. So examples of anxiety disorders are PTSD, phobias, social anxiety, panic, and GAD. OCD is both like, it's an individual classification, but it's also a class of disorders that include hoarding and body dysmorphic disorder. Mood disorders include bipolar, major depressive, and subtypes. Personality disorders include borderline, antisocial, and schizotypal. Dissociative ones include dissociative amnesia, depersonalization, derealization, dissociative identity. Childhood disorders include ADHD, autism and spectrum condition, and others that are particularly striking children only, or are most well acknowledged among children. For example, autism spectrum disorder is most noticeable in childhood, but exists throughout the lifespan. And adults just learn how to use coping tactics to mask the condition, I would say. Tying it all together, or I would say actually autism is simply thought of as a childhood condition and it's ignored in adulthood. The conclusion, the self is ordinarily identified with the brain and the body, which are affected by genetic and environmental factors, supporting the diathesis stress model. Motivations are urges toward learned or instinctive behavior patterns, which aim to optimize or reestablish a desirable homeostatic balance based on perceptual and emotional preferences. For example, the preference for pain avoidance, perceptual pleasure seeking, fear and sadness avoidance, love and happiness seeking. So you can see that these preferences are not necessarily all what we would call homeostatic. Like, do we have a homeostatic need for love and happiness? I don't know if we call it homeostasis, but these are preferences, and some preferences clearly have biological homeostatic principles at work. like hunger and thirst, pain avoidance and pleasure seeking. But when we get into more abstract emotions, it's a little harder to see homeostatic at the physiological, instinctive, and survival level of analysis being so easy to connect with these emotions. Going on. The self and social and physical environments interact to co-determine stress and how a person learns to respond to stress. Cultures and institutions dictate normalcy and shape manifestations of abnormality through beliefs, such as through trance states or influence, or as we mentioned, we have a more fine-grained analysis, which we came to as a class, about normality. Normality is a convenient believing in consensus accepted truths. So, yeah. Cultures dictate normality and normalcy, and they shape the manifestations of abnormality through beliefs. I think that agrees very much with what we were discussing earlier. Okay. Now there is a laboratory activity today, but first I want to highlight the assignments that you are going to submit next week. So turn in podcast number 4 on Katie Morton, which is a YouTube thing. She just talks about therapy. And you have a befriending assignment that's due next week. Both of these are due on Blackboard. That's where we turn in all assignments now. Okay. That's the end of this presentation. Are there any thoughts or questions or comments? Okay. Let's now go to the laboratory activity. Okay. So today's lab is called Let's Play Doctor. I'm going to put you in breakout groups. Each of you is to secretly choose a disorder to act out. You could choose any of them that were mentioned toward the end of the lecture, or you can choose any disorder of your own choosing that was not mentioned, anything you know of or are interested in, or whatever. Just choose any disorder. So your group will try to guess it. I know that you're not all well versed on all of the different psychopathology conditions that exist in therapeutic analysis, but just do your best based on the knowledge that you happen to come with into this class. Do your best to characterize, if you're the actor, as well as to guess if you are the guesser, if you're the doctor. So one student at a time is going to be the doctor, and one is going to be a patient. And form some kind of an order. Imagine that there's like a circle, you're going around the circle. What seems to be the problem, says the doctor. And then the patient says what their problem is. They tell stories, they describe problems, they start vague and general, and then they get more specific with more questions from the doctor. If the doctor has trouble guessing your condition, keep describing your complaints and problems, gradually getting more and more obvious. This is kind of like playing 20 questions. But you don't have 20 guesses. You only get 3 guesses. And if you don't get the disorder correct after 3 guesses, we open it up to the rest of the group to guess what the disorder is. And if no one can guess it within, if nobody can guess it because they've already made their guesses and they're wrong, then the patient should reveal what they were acting out. And the group can discuss any reasons why they couldn't guess the disorder, and maybe could comment on how it might have been acted out differently or in a more easy, I don't know. So this is a chance for you to interact and diagnose, and as well as get in the head of the kind of pathology that you are acting out, that you're offering as a guessing game to your classmates. For credit, for lab credit today, please submit a nickname list of the disorders that were acted out by all members of the group. So I only want 1 submission per group. And I'm going to open up a submission category assignment on Blackboard for this right away. All right, so are there any questions before I divide you into breakout rooms?
Professor, if we're together in real life, can we not enter the breakout rooms?
Correct, yes. If you are actually in a group now, then do not join a breakout room. You will
And how many people should be in a group?
5 to 6 people per room. How big is the group in person that you have there?
I think we have like 13 people here.
Oh,
so
great.
we can divide it into like 2 or 3 groups.
Please divide it into 2 groups.
Okay, got it.
Wonderful. Thank you for checking. That's great. And that's great that you guys can get together. That's cool. Any other questions?
We submitted our nickname list and disorder on via line or Blackboard.
On Blackboard.
Okay.
So just a very short, small document that just lists those things.
Okay.
For credit. Thank you.
So just 1 person from a group that has to submit in the Blackboard, right? Not
Correct.
all of us.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, please. We're going to do this for, let's say, 20 minutes. Actually, this is the last activity of the day. So I'm going to end the lecture and end the recording. And you guys are going to just be in your breakout rooms.
Oh,
When 20 minutes is finished, I'll just check on you, or actually when you're done, you can just leave and sign off.
Mr. Jason,
Yes.
if we're right next to our friends and such, we just have to leave the group like right now, and then we can do the thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. You're working together as a group now, and when this group activity is done, class is done.
So like on average, how many people should be in the group again, please?
5 to 6 people per group, but it
Okay.
could be 7. Let me change that. Okay, I see. Yes. All right. So we have 9 rooms. And all right, I'm going to send you to your rooms now. Any questions first? All right. Enjoy the activity and enjoy a bit shorter class. And see you next week.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you.